Hi there, welcome back to Sample Market's Producer Tips and Tricks, the video series where we endeavour to provide you with sound design and production techniques to hopefully help speed up your workflow and deepen your understanding of the software and plugins that you're using. Today we'll be checking out some approaches for making electro drums in Ableton Live, taking in sound selection, production, programming, bus processing, hopefully providing you with some nice tips, tricks, ideas, inspiration along the way. So let's go ahead now and check out what we'll be making in this video. So let's begin by taking a listen to the drum beat I've made for this tutorial, and then afterwards we'll go through all of the production, sound design, programming techniques. And in context with the bass and pads. So we can kick off by taking a look at the drums within the drum rack here. I've dragged in 7 samples into the drum rack. A fairly standard 808 kick drum that I think was taken from Ableton's factory library of samples. Another kick to layer with the 808. Snare, clap, closed hat, open hat and percussion. Can start off with our 808 bass drum then. Fairly standard 808 kick drum sound. It's got lots of nice energy right down here. It's sort of 50, 60 hertz. I initially tried the overdrive because I wanted to bring a little bit more aggression to the sound via some saturation or distortion. I couldn't really get the tone I wanted with the overdrive, so I switched over to the saturator, boosting this by 14 dB, lowering the output so I'm not increasing the overall level of the sound. I find you can more effectively A/B what you're bringing this way. So you can see we're not increasing the overall level, but we're bringing quite a lot to the sound. So with that set up, I experimented with some of the different distortion algorithms we have on offer, ranging from more subtle vibes to more extreme destructive distortions. The soft sine I thought was a nice compromise. The programming for our bass drum is very simple. Just 2 kick drums every bar, and then I added in this quite pitched up synthesized kick drum sound. Obviously we need to take away the low frequency to make more space for our 808 bass drum because it has so much energy down there. The other thing I noticed with this kick drum, there's a little bit of stereo information, so I added a utility plugin, selected the mono switch. And this is just, the programming is exactly the same as the 808 bass drum, it's just playing on top. And the great thing about having a second kick drum like this is that you can control the transient of your kick drum very easily without having to go into your main kick drum and start EQing or using a transient shaper to boost the punch, let's say. So when your kick is getting lost in the mix, because I thought we need a second kick drum, because whilst the bass drum here, the 808 has lots of energy, without that punch in the mids and the highs, can get lost in the mix a little bit more. And obviously we can control the level of this depending on how much transient we want to bring to our kick drum. So there's our kicks. Then I added in the snare, quite a standard 808 sounding snare. It had a little bit reverb on there, so I shortened that, or got rid of the reverb using the release on the ADSR. Again, I've gone for some saturation to bring a bit of that aggressive electro vibe. The hard curve algorithm sounded really nice on this saturator. I've dialed down the dry wet. And I noticed, although the saturator was bringing quite a nice vibe to the sound, it was really boosting those mids and highs and making it sound a little bit trashy. So I've followed this up with an EQ and taken a few dB out at around 5k and also at 1k, because when you consider this clap that we layer in next, if you look at the frequency, most of the energy on the clap is at 1k. So on the snare, considering the clap and snare are playing together at the same time, to make more space for the clap, I've taken a little bit out of the snare at 1k. Then I wanted the clap for a bit more of a tail, a bit more high frequency presence. Classic 808 clap. I've pitched it down, -2 semitones. Added some reverb for a bit more splash, a bit more tail. And then I've added the ozone imager. With our main snare, lots of the energy is down the middle, and a lot of the sounds that I've used in this drum kit don't have much stereo information, so I wanted to bring a bit more width to my drums, so I've added this ozone imager to the clap. And then something I noticed when the clap and snare and kicks were playing, there was a little bit too much reverb tail. It's decaying a little bit too much, and it's decaying over the kicks, and it's just sounding a bit messy. So I followed after the reverb, of course, I followed this with a gate. And this is essentially chopping the sound off when the level falls below a certain threshold. So bring this up, and it cuts away more of the clap. So it's just taken away some of that reverb, the end tail, which essentially cuts it off before the next kick drum plays, making everything sound a bit neater, a bit tighter. Some fairly simple EQ as well on this clap. And then we've got our hi-hats. The first closed hat, quite a shuffly, skippy pattern, some variation on the velocities to give it a nice dynamic feel. I think with Electro, you don't want too much energy in the offbeats, because then it starts sounding very housey, and you want all the energy really on Electro beats coming from your kicks and your snares. We had our closed hi-hat, some basic EQ, and then I've added in the open hat. Provide some variation. So an effective technique for programming your hi-hats is to use the hi-hat choke, which will essentially stop the playback of one sample by triggering another sample. So if we go over to our drum group here, if you select the input output button here, it brings up a few more options, and one of these being choke. So this is meant to simulate the behavior of a real hi-hat on a physical drum kit. And if I remember correctly, the original 808 drum machine, the closed hat and open hat shared the same voice. So it's to make your drum programming sound more authentic, let's say. So what we can do here is send our closed hat and our open hat to the first choke group, and you'll hear the difference that this makes. We go back over to our programming. You can see our open hat plays here and it gets chopped off when the next hi-hat plays. And in this section here, we hear a bit more of the open hat because we don't have a closed hat playing straight afterwards. Some more very basic EQ on the open hat, just making sure there's no low frequency on there that could interfere with the kick drum. And then we have our percussion. If we bring this in. This percussion is essentially providing a bit more groove. A classic rim shot would have worked just as well here. If we look at the programming, quite a lot of percussion hits within this 2-bar section. Lots of variation with the velocities to give it a nice dynamic feel. EQ. And then something I noticed when everything was playing, especially considering the programming, that some of these percussion and hi-hat sounds are falling on the same hit as the kicks and the snares and claps. So to make more space for the kick and snare, what I've done is set up some sidechain compression on the hi-hats and the percussion sounds using this compressor, activating the sidechain, selecting the audio from to the drum rack, and then in this drop down box below I can direct which sound within the drum rack to use as the sidechain trigger. And considering we wanted to make space on both the kick drum and snare drum, I've had to set up 2 compressors. So this first one is being triggered by the kick drum. And the second one is being triggered by the snare. And then this was copied and pasted onto the hi-hats, the other hi-hat and percussion sound. So finally, let's check out the bus processing I applied to these drums. I started off with Ableton's Drum Bus plugin, which I think is incredible. It just instantly brings energy, warmth, helps all of the sounds gel together. And obviously you can go very extreme with this if you want. I settled for something a little bit more subtle. I mean, it changes the overall sound of the drums quite a lot. It doesn't completely destroy them. I've dialed the dry wet down to 50% as well to bring in a bit more of the dry signal. Tweak the output so we're not boosting the overall gain of the drums too much. And then I started experimenting with the PSP mix saturator, which is another one I love to use on drum buses, which has quite a different vibe, although it's doing a very similar thing essentially. And in particular, the tape 2 setting on the mix saturator is great on 808 bass drums. So I started playing around with the PSP mix saturator. Obviously, at a very extreme level, the hi-hats sound really nice and crunchy, but the bass drum just gets a little bit too distorted. So what I ended up settling for was a combination of both of them. Obviously, the mix is dialed right down here. And arguably, it's pushing things a little bit too much, but it worked well in the context of the drums and with the other sounds. And finally, I added an EQ to just boost some of the tops a little bit more, give it a little bit more of that modern electro sound. So what we've done here, this 8200 EQ from Pulsar is excellent, really nice for sweetening up the real high frequencies of a drum group, especially using this air filter. I've used the high pass filter to roll off any frequencies below 30 Hertz. I've used the air filter, boosting this by 2 dB. And I've also boosted a couple of dB at 7 or 8 Hertz. Essentially, this is the hi-hats, what we're boosting here. So we can A-B here. And so with regards to the programming, I had my 2-bar loop there. I've duplicated it, added a little double snare hit to provide that variation every 4 bars. I've duplicated all of this again, and then on this final 2-bar section added a snare fill. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this tips and tricks video. Hopefully it's provided you with some nice ideas for producing electro drums. And of course, if you'd like to stay up to date with future Sample Markets content being published on this channel, make sure you hit the subscribe button below.